Welcome back to the InnPact Podcast, where we explore the present and future of workplace strategy, operations, and how organizations actually make transformation work in the real world. Today, we're joined by someone who operates right at the heart of one of the biggest challenges that organizations are facing, not just designing strategy, but making it actually happen. Our guest is Amanda Muzzarelli, a global real estate and facilities executive with deep expertise in operating model design, supplier transitions, and large-scale transformation across complex organizations. Amanda has led global outsourcing transitions across dozens of markets, worked with Fortune 500 organizations, and built alignment across functions like legal, finance, IT, procurement, and operations, all while keeping business continuity intact. What makes her perspective so valuable for us today is that she focuses on something many organizations are struggling with. Not what the strategy is, but why execution so often breaks down. In this episode, we're going to talk about why alignment is so hard to achieve, what actually causes transformation efforts to stall, how to manage complexity during outsourcing and transitions, and what leaders need to do to build systems that people actually follow. Amanda, welcome to the InnPact Podcast. We're really excited to have you today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm glad to be here.
I think, for the benefit of our audience, I'd love to start with a little bit of background. And I know that you have built your career leading really complex real estate and facilities transformations, which is massive, and often during periods of major change like outsourcing, mergers, or restructuring. I'm wondering if maybe you could take a few minutes to walk us through your journey and what drew you to this space, and especially if you can talk about the side of that, the transformation piece, which I know so many enterprise companies are facing on a regular basis.
Mhm. Thanks. Well, it's kind of a funny story. I actually didn't start out intending to be in real estate or in transformation. I started off in communications and was an executive speechwriter and worked in public affairs for the first 10 years of my career. And then I got swooped up into, hey, we got this great opportunity for you. And that's when my real estate and corporate facilities and transition experience began. I moved my family out. So not only have I managed those transitions for organizations, but my personal life, those are fun too. But what really drew me to that is there's so much emphasis on strategy. Oh, the great plan. There's a great plan. And even as I was a speechwriter, I saw a lot of plans coming together and being communicated effectively really was the difference between whether the strategy gets off the ground or whether it kind of stalls and stays an idea on a PowerPoint presentation.
It's interesting because one could argue that you went from one area of managing risk to another area of managing risk because, corporate communications is most certainly like that. And I do think that time of watching or guiding or shepherding companies through great change, I can absolutely see how that translates. In these leadership roles that you've held that have, massive portfolios and global operations, if you look back now and after you've made the transition, what do you think were some of the early moments after you transitioned over where you realized that, the point that you just made, which is that just the strategy alone is never going to be enough, that it's actually putting that strategy into place and the, executing the plan is where things really succeed or fail?
Well, I would say I've seen a lot of organizations have great strategy, great plan. The global organization made some decisions, said this is how we're going to do it. And then there's this big gap between them making the decision and then asking the people to change who are in the field, who are in the regions, and having to implement those changes. And the gap isn't intentional. And I don't necessarily think it's an oversight. It's really understanding how your own organization works, what the communication channels are, and what the expectations are. I think a lot of times the people on the ground kind of making the decisions have the ability to communicate across with their peers, but the peers don't report to the same boss. So if the upper leadership hasn't had the conversation and the expectations haven't been set, then it doesn't necessarily translate well when it lands on the ears of people in the field.
Is that where you started? And I find it interesting that coming from a communication background, that is it. Do you find that you're able to initiate those that people are willing to come to the table and have those conversations?
Yes, if you tell them that could be your stumbling block, this could be the place where if we don't set the proper expectations on the front end, then the transition and the transformation you're expecting to happen is going to have some difficulty. And that's where, but then you get to a point where some of the layers above are thinking, well, workplace really isn't my thing, or I'm not really responsible for facilities, so why are you telling me about this? I'm responsible for the operations and the growth of this whole region, and this is just a line item on my budget. Why do I need to get involved? So I think that there are a lot of inner dynamics that need to be managed, and making sure that if you're a corporate real estate person, that you have those open channels, not just with your own leadership team, but your leadership team has that channel and that political capital to make sure that they can influence operations if that's the way their organization is set up. I know there are lots of different permutations of how organizations run, but if you have something that's decentralized as far as decision making and operations, then you have to really pay attention to those dynamics.
Yeah, it's, and I see that play out all the time. I've worked in startup quite a bit of my career, and that is the one most beautiful thing about startups, is that it is so flat. It's lovely that everybody's coordinating, and then you see the pillars start to build, and all of a sudden there's everyone has their own Slack channel, and everybody has and you see it start to play out. So appreciate that, that you're a big part of your effort is bringing those people to the table. In our research, I read a great thing that you had said, which is that complexity has outpaced coordination. What does that actually look like inside of an organization, and what are some of those signals or sort of warning flags that those things are starting to break down?
Well, one of the things you could think about coordination is, okay, how do we roll this out? How do we communicate and stand up the new units, or how do we transfer the work from one supplier to another? And that's the coordination part, but the complexity is all in how the operation runs. And if you're working in a decentralized global organization where each operations leader, executive, has their own priorities, maybe it's about cost containment, it might not translate to what they're trying to achieve. So that's when the complexity shows up, because every one of those global regions has their own finance team, has their own procurement team, has a team of people who are watching that budget and are actually going to have to make the payments to the supplier that somebody else just gave them to work with. And if that's where you have that level of complexity, that no amount of coordination, unless you're doing it on the front end, and it's very, very well, I want to say what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say with the, what is it when you dance? Call it choreography. If it's not choreographed absolutely perfectly, then you don't understand the complexity you're even coming into. So you're trying to coordinate something that you haven't necessarily dug into. Now, that's not to say that every CRE function runs into this. Some of them do know their organizations better than others, especially the people who have been around for years and years and years. Let's say they have 20 years with the same organization. They understand how things work and how things get done, and they know how the budgets are managed. But if you have somebody who's just been in a seat for 2 or 3 years, they came in from the outside, they may not have that entire line of sight to where the people in the field are going to be resisting, because they don't have the same priorities.
What an interesting thing that you wouldn't necessarily think would be brought into a conversation like this, which is culture, right? Like someone that has an explicit or like a long-term view of what the company culture is, they might be you might find it easier to navigate within that culture, because they know, oh, well, I know how this person communicates or how this department works. I can sort of, give them the project in their terms. And I think if you layer onto that things like competing priorities, whether it's, within different departments or globally, same sort of, that complexity would be an added layer to that. I appreciate that. Um, I wonder if, along those same lines, you could talk to a little bit about, alignment. And so, part of the complexity is getting all of those people that are sitting at the table aligned. And, we say that a lot, and we certainly talk about that a lot, about having alignment within your organization. But in practice, it's really hard to achieve. Why do you think that alignment is so hard, especially across functions like legal, finance, IT, and operations? Why is it so challenging to get alignment among those groups?
I think, and this is hard, especially from our communications background, because those messages are so precisely mapped to reach the audience. If everybody even goes to the same meeting, they heard the same message, but they didn't take away the same actions in their minds because they really are coming from different perspective. Legal is all about the legal risk. They want to understand what's going to happen with a contract, how that's going to play out. Does the supplier that you're bringing on understand all of those local variations in the regulations and the information security steps that need to be done, because maybe they don't all reside within the company. Maybe there's some external factors in that specific region that affect it. Then you have procurement. Procurement might walk away with, oh yeah, we're all about the money. We have to make sure that this is the lowest bottom line number we can get. And somebody else has decided this. What does that mean for us? There are always these very important, but they're all competing priorities based on what the rewards are. And this is why enterprise change is so difficult, especially if you're a function that doesn't, especially if you're a function and you're trying to implement changes that will impact other departments and functions, because you don't have necessarily all of the rewards aligned. There's a lot of like executives in the company overall, they'll have their balanced scorecard. They'll have to have this much growth, this much profitability. They'll have to, have a bunch of other goals about employees and turnover and employee satisfaction. Okay, those are all things that the entire company can get behind. But if none of those are tied to the change that you're implementing, everybody else then has like another layer of goals and plans for their own department that they're being measured on. And if the change you're planning doesn't touch them, there's what's in it for them to really manage that change besides managing their small sector of it. And that's where you get an ability to not be aligned.
Yeah. And we see that play out quite a bit with our clients as well. Is that, largely, it's CRE that comes to the table looking for a solution for data, like about utilization data. And, we often ask the questions, especially in those initial discovery meetings, which is, hey, did you want to invite, your head of real estate? Did you want to invite your IT person? Because let's all lay all the cards out on the table and talk about, risks, benefits, and how we mitigate that, and how alignment happens early on. So appreciate that perspective so much. Yeah.
I wonder why your clients don't have that already sorted out before they come to your first meeting.
Yeah. And I think it's, as a personal experience, I've been a part of sort of, organizations where we're initiating a great big change, whether it's, migrating from one email system to another, et cetera, et cetera. And the point you raised earlier about that, wanting people to understand, and I hate to phrase it in such a way, but what's in it for me, right? And once you align there and you say, well, actually, what's in it for you is this, and understanding that to sell in to your peers or to the organization, you have to be able to understand what their competing priorities are and how this solution will have an ROI for them as well, without the added complexity or risk that you mentioned earlier, right? So, that is tough. That's hard because you have to think outside of your bubble. If you're working in CRE, you have to think outside of, how does this help our facilities team or our HR team, et cetera. So yeah, I appreciate that. I know that you've led some really large scale sort of supplier migrations across like, global markets, huge markets. And that's no small feat. That's extremely challenging. What do you think makes outsourcing transitions challenging in CRE or facilities management? What is that, the difficulty that's there?
I would say there are many difficulties, but some really stick out to me more than others. One of them is a lot of times the company that you're dealing with, if they're moving from suppliers, even at the beginning, they might not be as in touch with how their current supplier is performing as well as you would hope or you would think they would. You can ask them for the data. We're going to put this, RFP together. And they say, well, you need to get it from so and so, who's not even part of the company, who's a third party supplier, because they've been running it and they have their own nomenclature. They have their own categories for budget that don't even line back to the general ledger accounts necessarily. So, first of all, there's a lot of complexity in managing what you're even going after if you're at the beginning of the phase. But when you get to the actual handoffs, they're not as smooth as you would think. Sometimes the previous supplier who's leaving wasn't doing things they should have been doing. And you find out that the data for that region is completely missing from the main source of truth.
Wow.
And that the new supplier coming in is going to have to go back and refamiliarize themselves and take everything from paper to make it digital. Or they've been keeping records on, not in the software that was given to them, but in Excel spreadsheets that they had used just because they didn't adopt the first change.
Right.
When you know the supplier in the first place. So there are some deeply embedded habits and patterns that the company would have or the client's company would have that may not welcome the change. For example, if the first time was like what we call a first generation outsourcing effort, some of those people on that team, on the outsourced team, might actually be former company employees who still have really good relationships with the people they used to work with, used to be peers with in the same company. Now they just work for the supplier, same goals, different, team jersey. But now those groups are being replaced. So you still have that like added level of loyalty potentially to the outgoing supplier on the ground in the field, which can be very, very complex for people to get through. So that would be one of them.
Yeah. And I like the idea of, that the different jersey thing, because that's, and I guess along those same lines would be, people are used to having, whether, let's talk about data in this instance, they're used to having this regular sort of influx of data that they rely on for whether it's their daily stand-up or a quarterly board report. And that disruption within those transitions probably adds a layer of stress or complexity as well. How do you maintain that, continuity while you're absolutely changing service providers and making sure that the status quo or the things that need to get done day to day are also not disrupted in the process?
The trick with this really is identifying where those sticking points might be early in the process. I would even encourage people when they're in contracting with the new supplier coming in, that they understand exactly the responsibility for the data and where it needs to go. Does it need to be transformed at any point? Will it be shared with other suppliers who are also working with the company? Really understanding not just what the data is, but then also what your company has for regulations around that data and protecting it and how it will be reported. If that's not in the contract, then there's a lot of confusion come transition time. And there's a lot of finger pointing and hot potato with who's going to do this work. So I would say data is one of those critical efforts that if it's not handled early, that could stall your transition. If you're not giving yourself plenty of time to manage the data and ensure that what you have is a clean handover, that's the tough point. I also think it's really wise to run parallel operations if you can. I know a lot of people don't like to do that because they think, we're paying for double the staff or double. If you don't have an area of overlap, and it's just a switch, you're just causing a little bit more opportunity for risk there. And it's always good to have some experienced folks, even if they are the people who would be leaving or, um, handing off there through that actual transition and not necessarily gone after the go live date. So some time of overlap is nice.
Such good advice too. I mean, just not just for continuity, but also just to make sure that, you don't lose any fidelity in the data as you transition. I think that's really smart, making sure that, even if the previous contractor or vendor was not collecting or doing things as well as you would have, at least that there you had come to rely on that information. So making sure that that exists and that you cover your bases as you transition to someone new, I think it's really good advice. Smart. Um, I know that, when you're trying to do these massive projects, they're across regions, stakeholders, priorities. How do you create a structure where you keep everybody going in the same direction? You keep that ship plowing the same way and everybody on it. How does that work for you personally?
I've approached them a couple of different ways. I do think that through the years, I have learned that the process for transition needs to be structured enough to be effective, but light enough to be flexible. If you run a transition and it becomes some people's full-time job when they have another job to do, it is going to get deprioritized if it takes that much effort to keep it going with reports and logging progress and lots of different work stream meetings. I really think there has to be an approach that's a little more simple to get through those, or else when you pull the transition plan out, everybody's going to roll their eyes and go, oh my gosh, I don't have time to do that. Like, I don't have time to do that. Why would I need to meet with, this group of people weekly when I know that this function over here is the one that really takes care of that? Well, okay, so make sure you're getting timely updates. So you have to balance the need for quote control with the need for making sure it's not an administrative nightmare. That's the sure way to get some buy-in on your transition and keep everybody moving smoothly. I think having one source of truth, one place where all of the information is collected on status is critical. And sometimes that doesn't need to be a meeting. Sometimes you don't need to tie everybody up in that meeting. There needs to be a clear escalation path. So if decisions are getting stuck somewhere, people know where this specific topic or question needs to go to get sorted out. And if those things aren't clear, that can really kind of mess things up. So as far as keeping everybody aligned and going in the same direction, you have to have some of those safeguards and open communication, because really transitions, a lot of people, it's about process and technology. It's mostly about people.
I agree. Yeah. And I think probably the vast majority of us are self-servers, and there is nothing more beautiful than a weekly update. Nothing. There's nothing more beautiful than that. I can self-serve. I see what's going on. I have a next steps if I need to follow up with someone and who's responsible for what. Geez, I don't know that there's been a better invention in corporate in the corporate world than the weekly update. I swear. It's and I love it because it is that single source of truth. I think that's such good advice. Along those same lines, what are some of the mistakes that you see getting made that organizations are making during transitions that either have them go down, make the ship go left or right, or not stay on track? Things that maybe seem small at the beginning but turn into big problems later on. What are some of those mistakes?
I think with any transition or transformation that you're embarking on, the problems usually are baked into the system earlier on, really at the beginning of considering the change. Or if you're talking about suppliers, when you're mounting an RFP effort, when you're doing the contract, when you're figuring out the ins and outs of the contract, those things need to be decided before you sign the contract and not leaving anything hanging for transition. I've actually worked on some that were like, oh, we'll just leave that. We'll figure that out in transition, because there was pressure to get the contract signed by a certain date. And there are often those types of pressures, but leaving something about a certain phase or a certain work that will be done or what the scope is, leaving that to be decided later after the contract is signed, is just setting you up for change requests. It change orders. It's not a pretty thing. So trying to make sure that everything that needs to be decided, roles, responsibilities, who is going to do which type of work, especially if you have multiple suppliers and you're dealing with a supplier ecosystem, making sure that's very clear in the contract for all the parties before you turn it over into a transition. Because once you turn it into a transition and decisions need to be made about work and how it will be done, it starts to become a real mess if it hasn't been decided or written down earlier.
Yeah, alignment, right? Even under a contract, I think that's,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
it's that old saying, short-term pain, long-term gain. It might seem like a lot of administrative or a lot of alignment meetings or whatever upfront, but if everyone's on the same page, then and all the questions have been asked, then it's going to run smoother for sure, right?
And I do think that not all the questions get asked sometimes. Even the most expert, even the most experienced of us who are involved in change management, sometimes there's a question that doesn't get asked because everybody assumed it had been, or everybody assumes this is the way it always goes. You really have to fight against the idea that everybody already knows this is the way it goes, or this is the way things work, because those assumptions are what will torpedo your transition.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And you've alluded to this previously, but when it comes down to actually executing the changes, whether that's a restack of a building or you're adding meeting rooms or it's a massive merger or an acquisition of another team, in those high ambiguity moments where you've got so much of that stuff going on, at the same time, you're trying to manage the human element of that, right? Like the dynamics that you just said, which is, it's the people that add a bit of complexity, and we understand because people change management. They want to know what's going on. They want to be able to manage their own bubbles. But how does, managing that human side of it ultimately determine whether a transformation actually sticks? Because that's the key, right? Is you want the transformation to stick.
I think that's where you have to look at it from that individual, the human side of the change. It really is about reinforcement. There are several different phases of change, and some of those are, okay, what's the change? How does it affect me? That's the second question. The other one is, okay, how do we do this? What do you want me to do? And they get told what to do. And how do I know I'm doing it right? How do I know I'm doing it right? People always get oh yeah, what's the change? What's in it for me? How do I do it? Okay, great, we're done. No, you're not done. You have to explain to people. You have to give them the reinforcement. You have to give them that measurement. You have to get back to them and say, yeah, this is exactly what we need to have happen, or this is not quite right. That feedback loop and making sure that people understand now that you've done the change, yes, it's going well. Here are some of the results we're seeing from it. And then here's how you can share your success with other people going through the change. Maybe some people are ahead and they're really good at it, or you've done it in several different phases. And the people on the front end have it all down cold. But the third phase of the change, they feel neglected. Well, you got to make sure that the people in the first phase can talk to the ones in the third so they can tell them how to keep going and be there to mentor them through that change. Making sure it sticks is about making sure that all of the support structures that people need to change are there. Not just the first three, but the back end of it, which is the reinforcement and the rewards, and then the measurement. Like, how do I know this change made a difference? And making sure that gets tracked and it's reported back to the people actually doing the change. Sometimes, oh yeah, the change is made and all the reports go upstairs, go to executive, and the people who actually were changing might not get the metrics that back up the change and the work that they have been doing.
That's an extremely important part, and I'm so glad you brought that up. A lot of the work that we do with our clients is, workplace studies, right? So they say, oh, we don't have enough meeting rooms, and so they're looking at data before, and then they, based on that, they say, okay, well, this is the change. We need 2 more large meeting rooms and not so many small, whatever that scenario might be. But that absolute, reinforcement of measurement You know what I mean? Looking at it before, making the change, but then looking at it after and reporting back and saying, look, like we've reduced friction, or we have, the meeting rooms actually have some flexibility now, and they're being used in the right way, or whatever it is that you're measuring. But I love that commitment to measurement and also reporting back on what the measurement is actually, exposing, which is, yes, this worked, or no, it needs to be something different, or, but having all of the people, all of the stakeholders involved in that reporting after the fact. I think that's such an incredible thing to do. It's so smart. Because then you make the next big change, people are in.
Right? Right now you've baked in a little trust, but I think it is very interesting, because I think the next time you do it, they'll be like, oh yeah, when we changed before, here were the results we got, and we were actually able to individually either do more strategic or enterprise type work instead of worrying about tasks. I think when it comes to AI, people are going to see that when they see their individual workload shift, so that they're doing fewer of the things that used to be annoying for them, and they can actually focus on the things that will grow and develop them, then they personally will have a stake in that change. So I think it all kind of comes down to it's going to come down to the leaders to reinforce the change and make sure that it is good for everybody who is involved.
So I think it's also helps organizations move past and I think there's some fatigue among employees, which is the, change for change's sake, or change for a shift in XYZ, right? Which is like, we're actually making the change, we're measuring it, we're looking at the impact of it, instead of just, vibes. It feels like it's time for a change.
It's working. It feels like we need a change. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of change that happens because of vibes, and I think that there might be some, fatigue out there for that kind of change. But I love this perspective of you involve the team in the change and in the impact and the measurement of that. And you're saying, actually, we're running something here that we deeply care about, and we care about the change, not just, shiny new furniture as an example. So I think that's pretty interesting.
But shiny new furniture is fun.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. But does it move the needle? I don't know. Definitely feels good. Okay, so we like to do a little something at the end of our podcast called a rapid fire. So I hope you're up for it. Just a couple of quick, right off the top of your head answers here. So if I asked you just top of mind, what's the biggest reason that transformation efforts fail?
Nobody really owns that space between the strategy and the actual execution. Like, there isn't somebody figuring out that messy middle.
Good one. What's the one thing that you would advise leaders to do to improve their execution immediately?
I would say, don't add anything else to the plate. Stop adding priorities unless you're going to take some away. Limit it to 3 if you can.
It's a good one. 3. 3 is manageable, right? I mean, where should organizations start if their strategy is clear, but their execution is stalled? Where should they start?
You should take a look at their overall plan, think through it, and say, okay, where are decisions not being made? What ones are we either avoiding or don't we have clarity on? They need to go back and fix those.
Good one. Love that. Amanda, this has been such a great conversation. And I think that, one of the biggest takeaways that we can take from today is that most organizations don't have a strategy problem. There's lots of consultants to go around, but they do have an execution problem. And I think that, they may have the vision, the plans, and the intent, but without the right systems, structure, and alignment, that strategy never fully comes to life. And what you've highlighted for us is that the execution isn't accidental. It's meaningful, it's thoughtful, it's premeditated, and it has to be intentionally designed. And I really appreciate that. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your incredible experience and perspective. It was really valuable. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jennifer.
You're welcome. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do share the episode or send it to a colleague who wants to bring more humanity, purpose, and insight into their workplace strategy. You have been listening to the InnPact Podcast by InnerSpace. I'm your host, Jennifer Shannon. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.